terms of future workforce, which type of school, private or public, do you think is preparing the children be better prepared for the world of AI and remote work?
My answer is going to be public schools. I think that even in a very digital world, particularly post-COVID, where we still have lots of working from home, working at a distance, and with the advent of artificial intelligence, none of that is going to replace the absolute need, not only for us within a nation of the United States, but in our global economy. We have to have students who not only have been exposed to different ways of thinking and different ways of understanding and interpreting the world and different possible answers that come from that, but have had direct experience doing that. It cannot be theoretical, right? We cannot place students in echo chambers where everybody looks like them, believes like them. They're following a very narrow curriculum. We should not expect them to as easily adapt to a multicultural society like we have in the nation and certainly across the globe. This is multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious, all of that. That is why I do continue to believe that public schools, by their very design, are uniquely qualified and situated to provide that type of experience and education, as private schools simply, they're not designed that way. So we can't really be mad at private schools for not doing a good job at that because they're not designed to do that.
Oh, but public schools which are in affluent areas where the families living in that area anyway are making a good amount of money, have expensive houses, you're anyway attracting that kind of crowd into these public schools, right? So what is the difference between the public and the private schools then? It's not like you have a mix of students. You have kids from rich families in these public schools.
Absolutely. We do so have a significant segregation problem in the public space, both in terms of economic, but also especially racial. Like I said, my critique of the private space is not to suggest that public schools are doing it perfectly. There was a study, I believe it came out in 2019, that found that in public schools across the nation, schools that are dominantly white receive all the same money that all of the other schools receive, but they also receive an additional $23 billion a year in funding simply because of property value variance between these affluent white suburban neighborhoods compared to the inner cities, right? So there is a problem. We have to have a conversation about equitable funding, but the public school, by its very nature, at least has the capacity to address this, whereas private schools, by their design, do not have the capacity to address that.
That makes so much sense. All right, so Dr. Brewer, if a parent was touring a school tomorrow, a private school, what is the most relevant or awkward question they should ask the principal or the person who's giving them that tour that will really give them a good insight into what's actually happening in that school?
It's a good question. Me personally, I would have lots of them for the principal. Some of those questions might be, talk to me about not just my child's future teacher, if we were to start here, but across the board. Talk to me about the credentialing that the teachers at this particular school have. Do they have high school diplomas? That has to be a question because, again, in the private space, they can hire people without high school diplomas. And that might sound silly, but again, these are questions that you would have to ask in the private space where you don't have to ask in the public school space. Do all of your teachers have high school diplomas? What percentage, or do all of them have at least a bachelor's degree, and so on? And in addition to that, tell me about the years of experience, right? Because, and this is not exclusive to teaching and education, but any profession, you will get better at your job the longer that you hold that job. Across the board, we do tend to have a longevity in the public school space. We really don't have a lot of good data on the private school space, and some of that's by design. They're private in nature. They don't have the same reporting requirements that public schools have, right? So these are questions that the parent would have to ask. And again, this is important. It's not just about one or the couple of teachers that my child might have. We know that the experience level and the education level of all of the teachers in the building, all of that has an impact on all of the other teachers and all of the other students, right? So that is an important question to ask. Some additional questions might be, does my child do and even me as the parent or my family as an extension, do we have to adhere to a particular religious doctrine? And even within that, is my kid going to be kicked out of the school if they don't identify with their given pronouns, right? Like whatever it might be. Because if I'm spending $50,000 a year on my kid's education, but the school, they can kick my kid out, generally without a refund, because they might say something or do something that doesn't align perfectly with whether it be a religious point of view or a political point of view. These are important questions to ask. And again, these are questions that your listeners or any parent who's considering these spaces has to ask, that they simply do not have to ask in the public space. That is by design. If I have a student with special needs, my question is going to be, tell me about the services that are available for my particular student relative to their IEP, their 504, whatever it might be. Because keeping in mind, a public school, they are required by federal law to adhere to individualized education plans. They are required by law to do that. Private schools are under no obligation whatsoever to provide those services to students with special needs. So yeah, there might be some really good private schools out there that have taken very seriously the obligation that they have to students with special needs, and they may be serving them very well, and I celebrate that. That tends to not be across the board what we see, but that would be another question I would ask. Also, questions about transportation. If I'm spending $50,000 a year in tuition, does that include transportation, or do I need to also provide transportation to and from the school? Once again, these are not questions parents have to ask in the public space. Okay. What about extracurricular? So again, not to drone on, but there are so many questions, and it seems to me that the bulk of those questions tend to come from the foundation of understanding that the private school is really not obligated in any way to serve any student that they don't want to, or at some point might change their mind on. They're questions that are protective of a student, which again seems to me to be, I think, in excess of what parents need to or should have to go through, because they have the opportunity for a public education where none of those questions are relevant.
Those are fantastic points, and I'm going to make a list of those before I go for a tour. But Dr. Brewer, one thing I missed while we were talking about the quality of education of the schools, public schools focus heavily on standardized testing. There's your MAP, and there's like so many of those, right? And that helps you understand where your child stands nationally, right, for a particular grade. Private schools, for some reason, tend to run away or do not have any of these standardized tests, right? Which makes me wonder, are you trying to hide the lack of progress? Or does it free the teachers to actually teach without being stressed out about tests? Because I know a lot of children do not handle testing well. They may be fantastic in class, but when it comes to testing, they are nervous.
So one of the things I like to do in my non-working time, I love to cook. And if I'm from the South, so lots of barbecue is usually what we tend to cook. I mean, if I have a giant brisket, I will definitely have an internal thermometer that is placed in that brisket for the duration of the cook, because I, as the chef, I have to know what is going on inside because I can't see it. Right, there has to be some type of measurement. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to put 15 thermometer probes into this piece of meat and leave it like that. Currently, I do think that public schools have not just an over-reliance, because it is not the teachers who are making these decisions, not the principals making these decisions. It is generally at the state level, the state government that is making these decisions, right, to not just have testing, right, because testing, it can tell us some things. It's not it doesn't have a monopoly on telling us whether or not it understands a particular topic. It's just one data point. What is happening across a lot of states now is that we have too many tests that are taking place that aren't providing any additional useful insights. It is simply just sticking more thermometer probes into the student, and that's not helpful. And in addition to it not being helpful, it does cause a lot of anxiety. I myself had testing anxiety, but it also takes so much time away from instruction time. Teachers have to focus not just in teaching to the test, but just generally speaking, giving up days of instruction just to administer tests, right? The private schools are not required to do those standardized tests. Some of them do, some of them. I would like to see the public space move more towards that paradigm, which is kind of where we were before the No Child Left Behind law, that increased accountability via testing. There's also a reason that a lot of public school teachers express a lot of burnout and dismay about the work that they have to do. So to that end, I'm glad that private schools are not doing as much testing as they do. But when we do get test scores from the private schools, I think it's important to keep in mind that those testing, the testing data that we have, that is self-selected. That particular private school has opted into that test, and they've gone the additional step further of opting to even report that data. Right? So this is always going to skew to the positive, because if I can pick and choose what metric I'm using, what instrument I'm using, then I can kind of pick and choose the ones that make me look better. I think that I'm appreciative that private schools do not do as much testing as the public school space does. That is not to say that I don't think that there's some cherry picking involved in the types of testing, the reporting that they're doing, but I would definitely like to see public schools move back away from the current testing era that we are in.
I do, coming from a country where test is everything, and I'm from India, there's a huge focus on academics and lots of testing. I do see the value in getting tested just so that you know where your child stands and where you need to improve. But I also see how we should reduce the number of tests. So there is that balance that they need to figure out right now. I know, and you feel free not to answer this question. Are there certain tests that the public school does? Let's just talk about elementary school right now, that you feel are absolutely important, and some that you could make do without?
So I think it's important to ask the question of what any particular test purports to tell us. Generally speaking, we understand testing to be a mechanism to tell us whether or not teaching and learning is taking place. When it comes to early childhood, I think there might be some tests that are useful, but again, that is a single data point. And the same thing with a grade, right? Like a 4.0 might tell us a little bit about a particular student, but it doesn't tell us everything about that student, right? It doesn't tell us about their ability to engage socially. It doesn't speak to their extracurricular, right? Their sports and all of those other things. It's a single data point. I do think that parents working in partnership with teachers, working in partnership with local school leaders, right? The assistant principals and the principals, that group, that is the absolute best group to determine whether or not good teaching and good learning is taking place, because they're the ones on the ground. Right? A for-profit testing company that is out of state, that is happy to make billions and billions of dollars a year providing some silver bullet test to tell us those things, it is probably in excess, I think, in terms of what we're spending money on. Maybe there's some utility in that data insight, but for us as educators, as parents, as citizens, to put not just all, but even some of our focus on those metrics, at least the way that we have in the past 2 decades, I think is misguided. Again, and to your question, particularly for early childhood, my questions of whether or not because I have two children in K-12, one of which is in elementary school, I'm less interested in what his grades look like. I mean, sure, as a parent, you want your children to have good grades and have good test scores, and those are fine and those are well, but that doesn't tell me a lot about what they do or don't understand. That comes from having a conversation with not only the teacher, but the student themselves, separately and together. Again, this is a group effort. This is a communal effort focused on the public and the common good, which is something, again, unique to the public school space that I think is something we should celebrate.
That is wonderful. What a fantastic way to close this episode. Dr. Brewer, thank you so much for being, such an incredible eye-opener and peeling back the layers of the business of these brochures and how, a parent should decide on whether a public versus private school is better for their child. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.
Whether a parent chooses a public or a private school, I think the most important deciding factor should be if you are happy, your child is happy, and if the school is actually adding some value to their skills and to their overall happiness. If you did like this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. I will be putting Dr. Brewer's resources, the link to his book, in the description section below. Until then, this is Rishanka Jones signing off.